My name is Clark. This is Clark the Knife, and I unfortunately do not recommend the Emerson Apache. The Apache is a big, badass, awesome-looking knife, but its size, materials, its price, and Emerson's quirks make it difficult to recommend in 2024-2025, except to the most die-hard Emerson fans. So let's start with some specifications here. The Emerson Apache, like all Emersons, is made in Harbor City, California, which is just between Los Angeles and Long Beach. Also, like all Emersons, this knife is truly made in America. Every bit of this knife, from the G10 on the scales, to the blade, to the screws, to every single bit of it, is manufactured in America from American materials. There are not many companies out there that share Emerson's complete commitment to American manufacturing, and as an American, I appreciate that, and I am willing to pay a premium for that. Blade here. Emersons tend to be larger knives, and this Apache is no exception. It's actually big even by Emerson standards. This is a 3.7-inch long clip point blade. Like most Emersons, it's ground from 125 thousandths thick, 154 cm. So 154 cm is the non-powder metallurgy version of CPM 154. Now, CPM 154 is widely known as a well-balanced mid-grade knife steel. Emerson has long argued they use 154 cm, which most would consider a budget steel in 2025, because it's easy to sharpen and maintain, even out in the field. You can sharpen it on brick, sharpen it on rock, whatever you want. It's also reasonably tough and reasonably corrosion resistant. While that's all true, CPM 154 is not a high-performing steel. It's not a super steel by any means. Edge retention and toughness is similar to your budget steels like N690 and 440C. Both of those are similar to those. Your edge retention by itself is about the same what you get from a well-heat-treated D2 or a VG10, and it's even less tough than S90V. I would prefer, based on what Emerson says they want to do, I'd rather see Nitro V, I'd rather see CPM D2, and I don't think those would be a lot more expensive, but Ernie's not changing from 154 cm anytime soon. You've started to see some Magna Cut, you've started to see some S35V in Emerson's, but they are still mostly that 154 cm. So this is a big traditional clip point. Your cutting edge here is very low. It's sort of even with the fingers when you're gripping the knife. And the blade is almost all belly from tip all the way to the back, with your tip just about even with the pivot here. Like all Emerson clip points, there's a very nice swedge up here. That is mostly aesthetic, but does take away a little bit of steel up at the front. You've got stone wash flats here and a machined satin on your main bevel. The top edge of the blade here sweeps upward just a little bit to add a little visual interest. And then stock-wise, there's almost no distal taper, meaning your blade is about the same stock thickness from the back here all the way out to the tip, except at the very tip, it thins out a bit. You got Emerson's usual branding and markings, including a serial number on the show side, while your lock side is completely sterile. Emerson does make some very gorgeous clip point blades. They make quite a few of them. The CQC13 is a clip point, the Appalachian is a clip point, and the Apache here is a clip point. They combine traditional styling with a little bit of extra personality and aggression. They look really cool. Moving back to your handle here. Emerson knows how to shape a handle, and while the Apache isn't Emerson's most comfortable shape, it's probably one of their best looking. You have your typical big Emerson finger guard up front here, which locks your hand into place. Really, your hand is not going anywhere behind that guard. Across the bottom, you've got a deep front finger index here, and the handle widens into something that looks a lot like a coffin pattern before narrowing again back toward the butt. The back of the knife follows that same coffin shape, with Emerson's typically excellent chunky jimping right up front. The combination of the jimping with this Emerson thumb ramp, the wave here, which also has that thumb ramp, means that your primary grip when you're nestled right up behind that front finger guard here is super secure with this coffin swell rolling right into the middle of your hand. Your construction here is typical for an Emerson in 2024. You have your non-nested titanium liners that sit very slightly inset compared to those G10 scales. The scales themselves are relatively thick, ridiculously grippy G10. Emerson G10 is notoriously some of the most aggressive G10, the peel ply texture here, on the market. Especially out of the box. A lot of people will sand this down, but anybody who has owned Emerson's knows if you carry your Emerson for a while, it will start to lose some of that grippiness. It will start to naturally, naturally soften over time. And people do sand it down to accelerate the process, though make sure if you do sand it down, you wear a mask because G10 is basically fiberglass and you don't want that in your lungs. When you start with your Emerson, though, when you first get it, if you don't sand it down, it is going to be like Velcro on your pockets, particularly when you are taking it in and out of your pocket. Your hardware is very simple. You've got a flathead screw on your pivot, and you've got some Phillips head screws for the rest of your handle screws. Steel, blackened, made in America, fits the tactical vibe. On the clip side here, you've got a very simple but very effective clip. Traditional Emerson sort of 3-screw design. It is a bent steel clip. It works really well. Again, you're fighting against this very aggressive texture here on the G10, but this clip has a very nice springiness, comes in and out of the pocket nicely, as long as that G10 isn't tearing up your pockets. Action. So the action on modern Emersons is very good, and over time becomes legitimately excellent with one major issue. So this knife here, you can sort of see them if you look really closely there, runs on nylon washers, which look and feel, they're nylon, but they look and feel very similar to Teflon. Like Teflon washers, they are no nonsense and work just as well when they're all gummed up and mucked up as they do squeaky clean. That's what you expect from Emerson, given that these are marketed as hard use knives. Out of the box, these feel a little grippy or a little gritty. These do have sometimes a little bit of squeak, which you can't hear anymore, but sometimes you'll hear sort of either a mechanical sort of grinding noise or a general squeakiness. But over time, especially with some use or with a little bit of lube, and I haven't lubed this one up at all, either KPL or Chris Reeves fluorinated grease works really well, you'll get a very smooth, very consistent washer action. I actually love the way that well broken in Emerson actions feel. You're talking actions that will glide open, that will shake shut. This one here, is getting there in terms of shake shut. And if I were to use it more and break it in more, this thing would shake shut very easily, especially again with a little bit of grease on that pivot. So these nylon washers end up great over time. Your detent on modern Emersons is just about perfect. If you listen here, you'll hear a nice crisp detent break. Emersons now use traditional single detents. They used to use double detents that gave you some mushy actions. But now you've got a very crisp, very nice single detent that gives you that clean break. It fires out very nicely, fires out very consistently. The knurled thumb discs here that Emerson uses, they're fantastic in use. This one, like most of them, is placed in just the right spot for your thumb to get purchased and press up and out, basically perpendicular to that pivot. It makes for a comfortable slow roller to boot. You can roll this out very easily, very nicely, very controlled, or you can flick it out. I do have one issue with the action, however, and it is a pretty big one, and it is this lockup here. So all Emersons are liner locks, or virtually all Emersons. And this Apache, like most of them, comes with a relatively late lockup. You're a little more than 50% here. I've never had any lockup issues with this Apache, but I have had lock failures on probably 1 in 3 of my modern Emersons and on every single one of my older Emersons. The ones that haven't failed me, like this Apache, and you can hear it there, will tend to have, especially if you fire it out, will tend to have some lock stick that takes a very long time to break in. And some of them the lock here, when you press on the blade here, you will see this lock bar move, and the lock bar will fail on occasion. This is not abstract. If you see the little scar I've got there right on the side of my finger, that is from an Emerson knife where the lock bar failed and the blade came down on the side of my finger. I don't know whether it is because the lock bar tension is relatively light, whether it's the way that they cut the lock face geometry. I don't know exactly what it is. And most of the time when you've got one where the lock bar is going to fail on you, it's going to feel kind of sketchy out of the box. But the fact is, Emerson lockups on their liner locks just either are sticky or they are unsafe. And that's been a problem with just about every Emerson I've had on one extreme or the other. And that's a safety issue. Unfortunately, lock failure is completely unacceptable to me in 2025. And as great as this action feels, as satisfying as this action is, it is something that I absolutely need to call out. And that is a shame because, honestly, these actions, once they're nicely broken in, are truly some of the nicest, best feeling, most satisfying washer actions on the market. And a lot of the other details are really nailed. This detent here is just the right amount of break, where it's enough to overcome so that you get that consistent action without being too strong. Everything is very flat around the pivot here, so you get a very nice, smooth, consistent action. When you can sort of get the action you want based on how much you lube or don't lube the pivot. It's satisfying to open and close. It's fun, but I just can't trust that lockup, and it's really, really disappointing. Cutting performance, it's a distinctly mixed bag. The clip point shape on the Apache is fantastic. The tip is both pointy and robust. It's easy to control with the way it's lined up directly in front of the pivot, and it's well positioned either for stabbing or for sort of precision tip work. The big, even belly makes long, sweeping cuts a breeze, whether it's going through cardboard, cutting through a bag of dirt, sawing through plants in the garden, or anything around the house where you're dragging that blade continuously through material. The tip is high enough to get up and around whatever you're cutting into, and it's still low enough that you can get down on a counter or do your sort of utility cuts when you want to. It is a big blade, which means when you're trying to do that sort of more precise, detailed work, it does get a little ungainly, but it is easy enough to choke up and hold the blade and get closer to that edge that it ends up being a relatively versatile blade shape. Clip points like this are classic for a reason. They are very versatile, general use blade shapes, and Emerson knows how to make one. The problem is this grind. So first, let's talk about the chisel edge here. And I actually love the Emerson chisel edge. So most Emersons aren't true chisel grinds because you have a chisel grind would be flat on this side and ground on this side. Instead, you've got a grind on this side, you've got a grind on this side, but you've only got an edge on your show side. It is not sharpened on this side. It's just flat right there. That means this knife has a conventional grind, but a chisel edge. You do see these chisel edges and chisel grinds more commonly in stuff like Japanese chef knives, but they are pretty uncommon in modern EDC folders. So some folks will say that this chisel edge means that when you push the blade through something, it's going to go off to one side. It'll want to sort of cut not straight down, but off to one side or the other. I've never found that with a chisel edge, though you do get that sometimes with a chisel grind. What a chisel edge does give you, however, is some pretty screaming sharpness out of the box. Because when you look at your edge here, because you've only got this one bevel, this very edge of the knife right there, right here, can get really, really sharp. If you think about it from an angles perspective, if you've got your typical V-shaped bevel and you've got, say, 15 degrees per side, which is a pretty steep angle, then this angle here is 30 degrees. On something like this, Emerson will usually sharpen their chisel edges to 25 degrees. So you've got here and here, that's a 25 degree angle right there. The fact is, you end up with a steeper edge angle than a lot of more conventionally sharpened knives. That means that and just the fact that, the way that they can sharpen it, these things get very, very sharp right at the edge, which is great. But there are two big problems with these Emerson blades, the Apache included. The first brings us back to that steel choice. This is, again, 154 cm, which is not a steel with a ton of toughness. It's not a steel with a bunch of edge retention. And so it deforms pretty easily under impact, and it deforms pretty easily as you use it. So while this apex can get super, super sharp when you first get it or when you first sharpen it, it will go dull relatively quickly. This is literally a knife that I can feel getting duller as I use it. So I don't test my knives hard, but I don't go easy on them either. My primary use case is in and around the garden. I drag my knives through dirt, branches, stems, whatever else needs to get cut, trimmed, pruned, or dug up. If I bring an Emerson with me, like the Apache, for a few hours out in the garden, it'll be well on its way to dull by the time I'm done, even if I sharpened it just before I got out there. It will still cut open a bag if I stab it hard enough, yes, but it won't cut plastic sheeting. It'll bind if I try to cut cardboard. It won't really cut paper. It'll kind of drag its way through. This sharp edge will come back pretty quickly, but if you're used to modern super steels, even stuff like S35VM, not even talking like S90V, then you will probably get frustrated by how quickly this edge goes dull. Excuse me. But the second problem is this grind. 125 thousandths isn't that thick, and this grind does look very cool. It's distinctly Emerson, with this big flat and then this satin ground primary bevel. And honestly, when you look at the way Ernie does his customs, where he zero grinds these, it looks so cool, and it is so distinctly Emerson. But unfortunately, with a flat that goes more than halfway down the blade, really this flat goes about 2/3 of the way down the blade, even though the stock isn't all that thick, this thing is just, let me see if I can get it there. Yeah, if you can see sort of down the choil there, this thing is just thick behind the edge. It is fat behind the edge, and it gets fat very quickly as you go up the blade. You feel this anytime that you need to drag the knife through material like cutting cardboard. The knife wants to split the material more than it wants to slice it. That also means that as soon as this edge starts to get dull, the whole knife feels very, very dull. Unlike something with more aggressive edge geometry that can still feel pretty sharp even when your edge has gotten dull. And so, the results is sort of what I've seen is when I hand my Emersons, the Apache included, to my non-knife nerd friends, they are the only like fancy, expensive knives I've ever handed to somebody where they have been like, "Oh, this is kind of dull." I actually had once one of my CQCs, not my Apache. I handed it to somebody, and they were so frustrated by how dull it was that they went and got a kitchen knife. That's like a steak knife. That's pretty embarrassing. Well, the Emerson Apache cut, if you're using it for big, hard use, heavy duty tasks, like, dragging it through, some burlap or cutting through drywall or whatever, yeah, it'll do it. And right after you sharpen it, this edge will come back and be super sharp. But if I compare it to even something like a PM2 here, this PM2 is just as tough. In fact, the blade stock is even a little bit thicker. But it cuts so much better. This edge is so much sharper than what you get on the Apache. And so this blade ends up looking really cool, but it's not actually that tough. The blade stock isn't actually that thick. It's thinner than something like an SNG, some of your really beefy knives. It's way thinner than that. But because of this grind, as cool as it looks, it just doesn't cut all that well. Now, the ergonomics are outstanding. Most, maybe all, of Emerson's production knives started off as customs. And the way Ernie shapes his handles seems to be very intuitive. He draws out curves on paper, he creates the final shapes by hand on a grinding wheel, and you see, like lots of videos of just Ernie working through these handle designs. These handles look like nothing else on the market, but they do work. Your primary grip here, where you get your hands right up behind this finger guard, you put your thumb up on that ramp, is as secure as you would ever need a knife grip to be. And it gives you complete control over the entire blade. Whether you're stabbing into something, whether you're pulling it through some material, you're pushing it down onto a surface, you have really, really good control over this entire edge. It's very intuitive, and it feels very locked into place. The way these handle scales are cut, with big flat surfaces on the sides and the front, and corners that look like they're almost hand rounded still by somebody at the Emerson factory, gives you tons and tons of grip. All your corners are nicely rounded and knocked down here throughout the entire scale, and the subtle swell behind this thumb ramp here, this little scoop, is particularly comfortable when you put it into your palm here. It's a big handle, and big handles are always easier to hold on to, but it's a really nice, really comfortable big handle, and it looks really, really cool. The sort of lean, straight, aggressive profile that you get from the Apache, paired with this clip point blade and this sort of coffin-style handle, it just screams tactical. This is one of the coolest looking Emerson knives, and Emerson knives are pretty cool in general. And then I just do have to give a shout out to the jimping here. This sort of fat, rounded jimping that Emerson uses. Really nice jimping, some of the best on the market. When you press your thumb down, it does give you more purchase. But when you don't, it is sort of rounded enough that you can just skate over it and use this thumb ramp just to get a little bit more leverage. Really well done. On to carry, though. Carrying the Apache kind of sucks. The same reason that this big chunky handle is great to hold on to, that does mean it takes up a ton of space in your pocket. When you fold it up here, it is thick, it is awkward, it's got all sorts of odd angles, it's relatively big and square, and it weighs 6 ounces. If you compare this folded up to something like, again, our PM2 here, you can see that this is this just feels a lot bigger in the pocket, especially when you go sort of this dimension. It's only a little bit thicker, but you combine that with sort of the overall fat profile at this front end here, and the fact that this is almost twice as heavy as your PM2. And then you've got this super grippy G10 until you sand it down, and then you've got this shallow carry clip. You add it all together, and this thing just feels like a big fat brick in your pocket. There are very few knives that are more uncomfortable to carry for me than a larger Emerson like an Emerson Apache. And the fact is, you are looking at a knife that is just as big as something like your, Hinder Eclipse here, about the same size. Again, frankly, if anything, a little bit heavier and a little bit bigger in the pocket. And it's just, if you look at blade stock, you're getting thicker blade stock on the Hinderer. You're getting construction that is just as tough. And you've got a knife that is, if anything, smaller and easier to carry than the Apache. So this is a knife that carries like a huge knife. It is big, it is tough, but it's, it's too big to carry. But when we go to fit and finish, my controversial opinion with Emerson's is that with a major exception of the lockup issues I mentioned earlier, I do think the fit and finish on modern Emerson's is very good and almost exactly to the specs that they are aiming for. So Emerson focuses on the parts of fit and finish that actually matter when it comes to performance, and they nail those across the board. Blade grinds are gorgeous and crisp. Factory sharpening is extremely consistent. Laser etching and stonewashing is clear and flawless. Your G10 scales here sit exactly the same amount proud of the liners, except on the jimping here where your liners and your scales come precisely together. The blade is perfectly centered or very, very close to it. It's sometimes a little bit hard to tell with that chisel edge, but this one looks perfectly centered, and frankly, every modern Emerson I've had has been perfectly centered. There is absolutely no play. And the way the action sort of smooths out over time, the way this just glides tells me that everything in this pivot area, your blade faces, your washers, the liners themselves, is all very flat and very square and very free of burrs and imperfections. When you look at the details, they can look rough. They keep a machine finish on your liners here. You know, this jimping here is quite simple. These edges just look a little rough. Your hardware looks a little cheap. But it all works exactly as it's supposed to, again, with the exception of that lockup. And Emerson's have a longer track record than just about anything else in the market of standing up to the harshest abuse you can put a knife up to and coming out the other side. I will give you, old Emersons were crappy. They had unacceptable quality control issues, but modern Emersons get all the important stuff right, except for that lock bar situation, which remains frustrating and disappointing. That brings us to value. This is a $250 knife, likely $300 after shipping and tax. Is the Emerson Apache a good value? If you look at the materials, no. You've got a simple slab-sided knife with nylon washers and a dated steel. You've got none of the fancy fit and finish you get from Chinese OEMs. You've got a level of manufacturing precision that, to the eye, looks like it is a step below what Spyderco is doing in Golden, Colorado, or what Benchmade is doing in Oregon, let alone what you get from somebody like a Hinderer or a Chris Reeve. But unlike Spyderco and Benchmade and every other manufacturer that's been raising their prices year over year over year, Emerson, kind of like Hinderer, has kind of stayed the same over the last 5 to 6 years in particular. The result here is that this Emerson Apache at $250 is only a little bit more expensive than your PM2. And it's cheaper than anything that Benchmade makes of similar sort of size and toughness. So for solid American-made knives, you're looking at the Apache in the same realm as your PM2, which is at the sort of bottom end of the pricing of your pricing tiers. I could try to break down whether this knife is worth $250, but that feels completely reductive and like it's missing the point. Nobody's buying an Emerson Apache because they think it's an optimal way to spend their money. They buy an Emerson because Emersons are cool. They look cool, they feel cool, they have an aura about them and a design philosophy that is wholly distinct and absolutely compelling. And the Apache is one of the coolest knives that Emerson makes, which is why it sells out in a day or two almost every time they make more. There's no way that I can say that this knife is a great value. But I can also say that with the level of quality that their newer factories are putting out, if this knife speaks to you, you'll be happy enough with what you get for $250. Emerson isn't dropping the ball. So to summarize with 3 things I like and 3 things I don't. My 3 favorite things about the knife are the looks, the action, and the ergonomics. This is a badass looking knife with a truly classic Bowie blade and a classic inspired handle shape with a lean, mean profile. There's a reason you see Emerson fans flashing their Apaches all over Instagram every time there's a drop. It simply is one of the best looking production knives on the market if you like that tactical vibe. The action, once it's broken in, is legitimately superb. The detent is crisp, the thumb disc works perfectly, and the nylon washers break in to become ever so smooth and consistent. Emerson makes me want to see more knives on nylon washers. And the ergonomics from this handle are excellent. The knife is big and hand-filling, but that primary grip right here, right behind that finger guard, is hyper secure. The handle is nicely rounded everywhere it matters, and it feels ready to work and work hard. My 3 least favorite things about the knife are the lockup, the grind, and the carry profile. This Apache here has lock stick. Nearly every Emerson I've owned has had either lock stick or a risky lock that will fail from time to time. That is a solvable problem in 2025, and it's frustrating that Emerson, which only makes liner locks, doesn't seem to be able to make a consistent and reliable liner lock. The grind is simply too shallow and too fat to be useful, which mitigates the fantastic edge sharpness that you get from this chisel edge and makes the limitations of the 154 cm all the more visible. Your really great hard use knives, like your PM2 or like your Strider SMG, these knives can pull double duty. They can be very hard use, but still be sharp enough to be a good everyday carry knife. The Apache, because of the way this grind is done, simply can't. It doesn't feel like it's sharp enough for everyday use. And then finally, this thing is an absolute boat anchor in the pocket. It's big, it's thick, it's heavy, it's clunky, and it's covered in G10 that is just too grippy for most people. Even if it was a more effective cutting tool, given how big and heavy this thing feels in the pocket, I still probably would not carry it all that often. And all the other knives that I've mentioned, your PM2, your SMG, your Spartan Harsey folder, your Hinder Eclipse and XM18, all those, they're all easier to carry than the Apache while being as tough, if not tougher. And so overall, I can't recommend the Emerson Apache. The cool factor of this knife is off the charts. And if all you care about is aesthetics, or if you really don't care if a knife is big and chunky and heavy, and you really don't need your knife to cut all that well, or if you're totally bought into the hyper-masculine worldview that Emerson puts out, well, then you don't need me to tell you that you will probably love the Apache. But for everybody else that just wants a good, useful cutting tool, the Emerson Apache is simply worse and less useful than most of the other knives you could get for about the same price. There are some fantastic bones in here. The design is great, the action is superb, and I would love to see more knives with chisel edges. But the drawbacks in the overall package are too much to live with. You can find knives that are just as tough, but cut better, are easier to carry, and don't have locks that stick or fail, all made in America for a similar price. I like Emersons. They're fun. I've owned way too many of them over the past few years, but I can't recommend them, especially the larger ones like this Apache here. They are not the best choices for doing the things that a knife is expected to do. The Apache is no exception. I've been Clark, and this is Clark the Knife, and I hope you found this useful, entertaining, and that I respected your time. If you've taken the time to watch this far, I do have one little request. I'm starting to build a better way to buy and sell knives. I've left a link down below in the description for you to leave me your email address if you'd like to learn more once I'm ready to show what I'm building. It would mean a lot to me if you signed up. I'm still in the very early days, and I'm learning to build as I go, but I'm excited to give something back to the community. Thank you very much, and have a great day.